The millionaire had trouble looking a woman in the eyes due to trauma, but an unexpected hiring of a new cook helped him overcome his fear. The millionaire discovers hidden truths. Follow the ending of this beautiful story until the very last moment. The Blackwood estate stood like an impenetrable fortress on the highest hill of Greenwich, Connecticut. Its modern glass and steel structure, a stark contrast to the old money mansions that dotted the neighborhood. Much like its owner, it was beautiful but cold, impressive yet distant, a place where people looked but never truly saw. Ethan Blackwood moved through the east wing of his mansion with calculated precision, his Italian leather shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows that followed him like obedient servants. At 42, Ethan had perfected the art of control. His dark hair, peppered with distinguished silver at the temples, was impeccably styled. His tailored Tom Ford suit fit like armor, protecting him from a world he refused to let in. "Mr. Blackwood, your 9 a.m. call with Tokyo is ready in the study." Mrs. Henderson, his household manager for the past 8 years, appeared at his side. With practiced efficiency, her voice carried the right amount of deference, not too familiar, not too distant. "Thank you. Have Jeffries bring the car around at 11:30. I'd like to avoid traffic on the way to the board meeting." His voice was deep and measured, never betraying emotion. "Of course, sir. Also, Chef Marcus has submitted his resignation. His replacement arrives today." Ethan stopped walking. The slightest furrow appeared between his brows, a microscopic crack in his perfect composure. "Resignation? Why wasn't I informed earlier?" "It was sudden, sir. A family emergency in Chicago. The agency has sent someone highly qualified. As a replacement, her credentials are on your desk." Ethan resumed his pace without acknowledging the information. Changes. He detested changes, especially unscheduled ones. His entire existence was built around a carefully orchestrated routine that kept chaos at bay. Every person in his household was selected after thorough background checks and psychological evaluations. No one entered his world without being vetted, controlled, and positioned exactly where he needed them. Inside his study, Ethan closed the door and stood before the wall of windows overlooking his 10-acre property. Beyond the manicured gardens and Olympic-sized pool lay Long Island Sound, stretching toward the horizon like a sheet of blue glass. This view had cost him millions, but money had never been an obstacle for Ethan Blackwood. As the founder of Blackwood Technologies, one of the world's leading cybersecurity firms, he had amassed more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. Yet for all his success, for all his power, Ethan lived like a man in exile. His business meetings were conducted with clinical precision. Social events were strategic appearances, carefully timed and executed. Women came and went in his life like seasonal staff, present for their purpose, then dismissed before they could ask questions that probed too deep. The intercom buzzed. "Tokyo is on line 1, sir." Ethan straightened his already perfect tie and pressed the speaker button. "Blackwood here." For the next hour, he negotiated a multi-million-dollar security contract with a Japanese conglomerate, never once faltering in his delivery or losing his commanding edge. When the call ended with terms favoring his company, he didn't smile or celebrate. Success wasn't something to be celebrated, it was expected. He picked up the folder Mrs. Henderson had mentioned. The new chef's resume was impressive. Olivia, Morgan, 34, trained at the Culinary Institute of America, experience in Michelin-starred restaurants across New York and San Francisco. Previous employers included tech billionaires and Hollywood executives. Her references were impeccable. What Mrs. Henderson's efficient summary didn't mention was the photograph attached to the file. Olivia Morgan had eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it, deep brown with flecks of amber, set in an oval face framed by unruly chestnut curls that defied the professional headshot's formality. Her smile wasn't practiced or polished. It was genuine, with a slight symmetry that suggested she laughed often and without restraint. Ethan closed the file quickly. The photograph had made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't articulate. There was something unsettling about the directness of her gaze. At precisely 11:30, he left for his board meeting in Manhattan. The day proceeded as it always did, with meticulous attention to schedule and zero allowance for spontaneity. He returned to the estate at 7:15 p.m., handed his briefcase to Mrs. Henderson, and headed to the dining room for his solitary dinner. Today's first indication that something had changed was the smell. The usual subtle, precisely executed meals that Chef Marcus prepared had been replaced by something more alive. Aromas of garlic, rosemary, and something citrusy wafted through the normally sterile air of the mansion. Ethan paused in the doorway of the dining room. His place was set as usual, the finest china, crystal, and silver at the head of the enormous table meant for 20, but the familiar tableau was disrupted by an unexpected addition: a small glass vase holding 3 wildflowers, clearly plucked from the far edges of his property, where the manicured gardens surrendered to nature. "What is this?" he asked when Mrs. Henderson appeared. "The new chef." "Thought it might brighten the table, sir. I can remove it if—" "Leave it," he said, surprising himself. "Where is she?" "In the kitchen, preparing your dinner." Ethan settled into his chair, inexplicably annoyed. Chef Marcus had understood the rules: prepare the meals, leave them with the service staff, and remain invisible. The kitchen was to function like a perfect machine, with no unnecessary human element intruding into Ethan's carefully constructed solitude. The door to the kitchen swung open, and instead of the usual server, Olivia Morgan herself emerged carrying his dinner. She was shorter than her photograph suggested, barely reaching 5'4", but she moved with a quiet confidence that filled the room. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, placing the plate before him, "I hope you don't mind me introducing myself. I believe it's important to know who's feeding you." Her voice had a slight raspiness, as if she'd once been a singer who'd spent too many nights in smoke-filled jazz clubs. Up close, her eyes were even more disconcerting. Not because they were particularly beautiful, though they were, but because they looked directly at him without the usual deference or fear his employees exhibited. "Ms. Morgan," he acknowledged. Stiffly, "I generally prefer my household staff to communicate through Mrs. Henderson. I understand. But since you'll be eating my food every day, I thought we might establish a direct line of communication about your preferences." She gestured to the plate. "Tonight, I've prepared pan-seared sea bass with a lemon caper sauce, accompanied by roasted spring vegetables and fingerling potatoes. For dessert, a simple vanilla bean panna cotta with blackberry compote." Ethan looked down at the plate. Unlike Chef Marcus's architectural food presentations, impressive but untouchable, Olivia's creation looked almost rustic. The fish was perfectly seared, the sauce drizzled not in artistic swirls, but in a way that suggested it was meant to be eaten, not photographed. "I don't recall specifying sea bass for tonight's menu," he said, his voice cool. Olivia didn't flinch. "You didn't. Your weekly menu indicated chef's choice for Thursday evenings. I took the liberty of selecting something I thought you might enjoy." She paused, then added, "I can prepare something else if this doesn't meet your requirements." There was something in her tone, not insubordination exactly, but a subtle challenge. She wasn't asking for approval, she was offering an alternative. "This will be fine," he said, dismissing her with a slight nod. Instead of leaving immediately, she remained for a moment. "Is there anything specific you'd like me to prepare in the coming days? Any preferences or dislikes I should know about?" "Mrs. Henderson has all that information." He picked up his fork, signaling the end of the conversation. "Of course. Enjoy." "Your dinner, Mr. Blackwood." As she turned to leave, Ethan found himself watching her. She didn't walk like someone trying to be invisible. Her steps were deliberate, her posture relaxed but dignified. The kitchen door swung shut behind her, and he was alone again, exactly as he preferred. He took a bite of the sea bass. It was, annoyingly, perfect. Not just technically excellent, but somehow infused with a warmth that had been absent from his meals for as long as he could remember. He ate methodically, clearing his plate with the same efficiency he applied to everything else in his life. When he finished, he should have risen and retreated to his study as he always did. Instead, he found himself lingering, his thoughts returning to the strange directness in Olivia Morgan's gaze. It had been years since anyone had looked at him that way, as if trying to see past the fortress of wealth and power to the man inside. "Stop it," he muttered to himself, standing. Abruptly. This was precisely the kind of distraction he couldn't afford. The new chef would learn the rules soon enough, or she would be replaced. His world operated on absolute control, and one employee's refusal to be invisible wouldn't change that. As he left the dining room, Ethan didn't notice Richard Webb watching from the shadow of the corridor. Webb, his personal security chief and right-hand man for 15 years, had observed the entire interaction with Olivia Morgan, his expression unreadable as he made a note in his phone. Nothing in Ethan Blackwood's life went unmonitored, especially potential disruptions to the carefully maintained order that kept his employer's demons at bay. 3 weeks passed, and against all expectations, Olivia Morgan remained at Blackwood Estate. Each day brought new small rebellions, not enough to warrant dismissal, but sufficient to disturb the sterile peace that had governed the mansion for years. Fresh flowers appeared not just on the dining table, but in the kitchen, the library, even the hallway leading to Ethan's private quarters. The formal menu cards gave way to handwritten notes describing the evening's offerings, sometimes accompanied by a brief story about the dish's origin or inspiration. Most concerning of all, the staff had begun to change. The kitchen, once a model of silent efficiency, now occasionally erupted with laughter. Even Mrs. Henderson, stoic, unflappable Mrs. Henderson, had been caught smiling as she carried a tray from the kitchen. On this particular morning, Ethan stood in his study, watching storm clouds gather over Long Island Sound. April in Connecticut brought unpredictable weather, much like the unpredictable shifts occurring within his home. The rain started softly, then intensified until it hammered against the glass with the same persistence that Olivia Morgan hammered at his carefully constructed walls. "Mr. Blackwood?" Richard Webb's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Webb stood in the doorway, his 6'4" frame filling the space imposingly. Unlike the rest of the staff, Webb didn't knock, a privilege earned through years of unwavering loyalty. "What is it, Richard?" "I've completed the additional background. Check on Ms. Morgan." Webb closed the door behind him, his expression betraying nothing as he placed a folder on Ethan's desk. "There are some inconsistencies you should be aware of." Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't immediately reach for the folder. "Inconsistencies?" "Her employment history checks out, as do her culinary credentials. But there's a 6-month gap in her resume 3 years ago. The agency listed it as personal leave, but my sources indicate she was in Boston during that time." "And?" Ethan kept his voice neutral, though something inside him tightened at the mention of Boston. "And Boston is where Sarah was from." Webb never softened his delivery, never cushioned the blow of Sarah's name. Ethan turned back to the window, his reflection ghostly against the darkness of the storm. "Coincidence?" "Perhaps, but there's more. Before coming here, she worked for James Sullivan." The name hung in the air between them. James Sullivan, Ethan's former business partner and current rival. The man who had walked away from Blackwood Technologies 10 years ago to start his own firm, taking several key clients with him. "That wasn't in her file," Ethan said, his voice tight. "No, it wasn't. She listed the employer as Private Residence San Francisco, but my contact at Sullivan Enterprises confirmed she was the executive chef at Sullivan's Palo Alto home for 8 months last year." Ethan finally turned from the window, his face composed but his eyes harder than before. "You believe she was placed here deliberately?" It wasn't a question, but Webb answered anyway. "I believe it's a possibility we can't dismiss. Sullivan has been trying to get information on our new security protocol for months. A well-placed employee inside your home would have unique access." Ethan walked to his desk and opened the folder. Inside were surveillance photos of Olivia, shopping at the local farmer's market, jogging along the beach path near the estate, having coffee with a woman whose face was circled in red. "Who's this?" he asked, tapping the photo. "Kate Reynolds, former employee of Sullivan Enterprises, Cybersecurity Division. They meet twice weekly at a cafe in town. Ethan closed the folder with a sharp snap. Have her replaced. Webb didn't immediately respond, which was unusual enough to make Ethan look up. The security chief's face remained impassive, but something in his eyes suggested hesitation. What is it? Ethan demanded. Before we act, it might be worth learning what she's after. If Sullivan has sent her, removing her now only means he'll try another approach. Better to keep her close while we investigate further. Ethan knew Webb was right. It was the logical move. Yet something about the thought of deliberately maintaining Olivia's presence in his home, of interacting with her while knowing she might be a spy, created an uncomfortable tension in his chest. Fine, he conceded. Keep her under surveillance. I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she talks to, and pull everything you can find on her past, especially that 6-month gap in Boston. Already in progress, Webb assured him, picking up the folder. One more thing. The charity gala for the Children's Hospital is this weekend. The board is expecting you to attend. Ethan suppressed a grimace. The annual gala was unavoidable, one of the few social obligations he couldn't delegate or avoid. As the hospital's largest private donor, his absence would be noted and questioned. I'll be there. Have Jeffries. Ready at 7. After Webb left, Ethan remained standing behind his desk, his mind circling back to Olivia. If she was working for Sullivan, what exactly was she looking for? The new security protocol was still in development, its details known only to his most trusted team members. And why would Sullivan resort to such an elaborate scheme when corporate espionage could be conducted more efficiently through digital means? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Henderson entered with a tray. I didn't request anything, Ethan said, frowning. Miss Morgan thought you might appreciate some tea, sir, given the storm. She placed the tray on his desk, a silver pot, a single cup, and a small plate of what appeared to be freshly baked shortbread. Before Ethan could dismiss the offering, Mrs. Henderson added, She mentioned it was Earl Grey with a touch of bergamot, apparently your preference according to Chef Marcus's notes. Ethan stared at the tray. This was precisely the kind of unprompted familiarity he discouraged. And yet, the thought that she had noticed his preference, a detail he himself barely acknowledged, stirred something unfamiliar. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That will be all. After she left, Ethan poured the tea and stood by the window again, watching the storm while the warmth of the cup seeped into his hands. If Olivia Morgan was playing a game, he needed to understand the rules. And if Webb was right about keeping her close, perhaps it was time to engage directly, rather than maintaining his usual distance. That evening, instead of waiting for dinner to be served in the dining room, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He walked into the kitchen. The large state-of-the-art space had always functioned independently of him, a separate world where his meals appeared as if by magic. Now, as he pushed through the swinging door, he felt like an intruder in his own home. Olivia stood at the center island, her back to him as she worked. She wore black chef's pants and a white jacket, her hair pulled back in a messy bun with curls escaping around her face. She was singing softly to herself, something bluesy and low, while her knife moved in a blur, transforming a pile of herbs into fine confetti. For a moment, Ethan simply watched her. There was something almost hypnotic about the efficiency of her movements, the easy confidence with which she navigated the space. Unlike the military precision of Chef Marcus, Olivia worked with a fluid grace that made cooking look less like science and more like art. She turned suddenly, sensing his presence, and the knife paused mid-chop. If she was surprised to find him there, she hid it well. Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice betraying only mild curiosity. Did you need something? I wanted to discuss the menu for the hospital gala on Saturday, he replied, the lie coming easily. I'll be attending with several board members. Of course, she set down the knife and wiped her hands on a towel. Although I'm not catering the event, I believe you're using Bradford Catering, according to Mrs. Henderson. Ethan hadn't known this detail. He left such arrangements to his staff. The fabricated reason for his visit evaporated, leaving him momentarily at a loss. Olivia seemed to sense his discomfort. but I'd be happy to prepare something special for you before you leave for the event. Perhaps a light dinner? The catering at these functions tends to be heavy on appearances and light on substance. Her easy manner, the way she smoothly covered his awkwardness, only reinforced Ethan's suspicion. People who were comfortable around him, who didn't feel the need to tread carefully, usually wanted something. "That won't be necessary," he said coldly. Then, deciding to test her directly, "I understand you previously worked for James Sullivan." She was caught off guard by the direct confrontation. She didn't show it. Her eyes met his steadily. "Yes, for about 8 months, his Palo Alto residence. That wasn't in your employment history. It was listed as a private residence. Many of my clients prefer discretion." She tilted her head slightly. "Is that a problem?" "It is when the omission appears deliberate. Sullivan is a direct competitor of my company." "I'm a chef, Mr. Blackwood, not a corporate spy." Her voice remained calm, but a flush of color appeared on her cheeks. "I cook for people who can afford me. Their business rivalries aren't my concern." "Everything in my household is my concern. Ms. Morgan, I don't appreciate discovering that my employees have hidden connections to people who might have motives against me." Something flashed. In her eyes then, not fear or guilt, but a spark of defiance. "With all due respect, if you're that concerned about my previous employment, perhaps your vetting process needs improvement. I didn't hide anything. I simply didn't realize I needed to provide a list of your personal enemies, along with my culinary credentials." The sharp response startled him. His employees didn't speak to him this way, ever. The normal response to his displeasure was immediate contrition, not challenge. "Watch your tone," he warned quietly. "Or what? You'll fire me." She crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "Go ahead. I've worked for more difficult employers than you, Mr. Blackwood. At least Sullivan appreciated good food, even if his personality left much to be desired." The comparison to Sullivan stung more than it should have. Ethan felt a flash of irrational anger, followed by the unsettling realization that he cared what this woman thought of him. Before he could respond, the kitchen door opened and Mrs. Henderson entered, stopping short when she saw Ethan. "Excuse me, sir. I wasn't aware you were in here." Her eyes darted between him and Olivia, clearly sensing the tension. "I was just leaving," Ethan said, his voice controlled once more. He turned to go, then paused at the door. Without looking back at Olivia, he added, "I'll be dining out this evening, don't wait up." He left without waiting for a response, his composure intact but his mind churning. If Olivia Morgan was working for Sullivan, she was either very good at hiding it or very bold in her approach. Either way, she'd succeeded in doing something few people managed. She'd gotten under his skin. In the hallway, he pulled out his phone and dialed Webb. "I want everything on Olivia Morgan by tomorrow morning, every detail, no matter how small." As he hung up, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just engaged in a battle he hadn't fully prepared for. For years, he'd maintained control by keeping people at a distance. Now, a woman he barely knew had managed to provoke a reaction he'd thought himself incapable of feeling. And somewhere deep inside, in a place he refused to acknowledge, a forgotten sensation stirred. The rush of actually feeling something real after years of carefully maintained numbness. The Children's Hospital Gala was in full swing by the time Ethan arrived at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the ballroom, where Connecticut and New York's elite mingled in a carefully choreographed display of wealth and philanthropy. Women in designer gowns and men in tuxedos circulated with champagne flutes, their laughter mixing with the soft strains of the string quartet. Ethan moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and accepting congratulations for Blackwood Technologies' recent government contract. Few noticed that his smiles never reached his eyes, or that he strategically positioned himself to avoid prolonged conversations. To most, he was simply Ethan Blackwood, enigmatic billionaire, generous donor, perpetual bachelor. "Ethan, I was beginning to think you wouldn't show." Jessica Palmer, the hospital board chair, approached with 2 glasses of champagne. She handed him one, her red lips curving into a smile that suggested they shared more than a professional relationship. a suggestion Ethan had never confirmed nor denied. The ambiguity served him well in social settings. "Traffic on the bridge," he replied, accepting the glass without drinking. "Congratulations on the turnout. It looks like you'll exceed last year's fundraising goal." "We've already surpassed it, thanks in large part to your matching donation." She touched his arm lightly. "The new pediatric wing will break ground next month. We're hoping you'll be there for the ceremony." "Of course." Jessica was still talking, something about naming opportunities and press coverage, when Ethan's attention was drawn to a commotion near the entrance. A woman in a midnight blue dress had just arrived, her laughter carrying across the room as she greeted the hospital director. Olivia Morgan. But not the Olivia he knew from his kitchen. This version wore her chestnut hair in loose waves that cascaded over one shoulder. The simple elegance of her dress accentuated curves that her chef's uniform concealed. She moved through the crowd with the same easy confidence she displayed in the kitchen. But here, in this setting, she looked like she belonged among Boston's old money, rather than staff quarters. "Ethan, are you listening?" Jessica's voice snapped him back to their conversation. "I apologize. What were you saying about the press release?" Before Jessica could respond, a man's voice called out, "Ethan Blackwood. Still working the room like you own it, I see." Ethan turned to find James Sullivan approaching, his silver hair and tanned skin creating the perfect picture of a tech executive enjoying his success. At 55, Sullivan had the relaxed demeanor of a man who believed he had nothing left to prove, a stark contrast to Ethan's perpetual vigilance. "James," Ethan acknowledged with a cool nod. "I didn't realize you were on the guest list. Last-minute addition. My new foundation is partnering with the hospital on their mental health initiative." Sullivan's smile was all teeth. "Jessica, you look stunning as always. Would you mind if I borrowed Ethan for a moment? Old business partners catching up, very boring stuff." Jessica excused herself gracefully, leaving Ethan alone with the man who had once been his mentor and then his betrayer. "What do you want, James?" Ethan asked, dispensing with pretense. Sullivan's smile dimmed slightly. "Can't two old friends catch up at a charity event? You're looking well, though perhaps a bit tense, still not sleeping through the night." The casual reference to Ethan's insomnia, a condition few people knew about, was deliberately provocative. Sullivan had always known which buttons to push. "I sleep fine," Ethan lied, "though I imagine corporate espionage helps you rest easier." Sullivan laughed, the sound genuinely amused. Still dramatic as ever. "I didn't come over to rehash old grievances. Actually, I wanted to congratulate you on the DoD contract. Impressive work." Ethan studied Sullivan's face, searching for the trap behind the compliment. "Thank you. And I see Olivia's working for you now," Sullivan continued, his gaze shifting to where Olivia stood, chatting with a group of doctors. "Excellent chef, isn't she? Makes a risotto that could bring world peace." The casual way Sullivan mentioned Olivia, as if testing Ethan's reaction, confirmed what Webb had suspected. This wasn't coincidence. "She's adequate," Ethan replied. Dismissively. Sullivan's eyebrows rose. "Just adequate? Then you haven't been paying attention. But then, that was always your problem, wasn't it? So focused on the big picture that you missed the details right in front of you." He sipped his champagne. "Like how the woman you trust most has been lying to you for years." A cold sensation spread through Ethan's chest. "What are you talking about?" "Ask your watchdog, Webb. Ask him where he really was the night Sarah disappeared." Sullivan set down his empty glass. "Or better yet, ask your new chef. I think you'll find she knows more than she's letting on." Before Ethan could respond, Sullivan was already walking away, leaving Ethan with questions he wasn't prepared to confront. The mention of Sarah's name had the same effect it always did, like a hand closing around his throat, squeezing until the present faded, and the past came rushing back. Sarah Lawrence. His fiancée, the only woman he had ever truly allowed close to him, the woman who had vanished from their Boston apartment 5 years ago, leaving nothing but unanswered questions and a void that had hollowed him out from the inside. The official. Investigation had concluded she'd left voluntarily. No signs of struggle, her passport missing, a substantial cash withdrawal from her account. But Ethan had never believed it. Sarah wouldn't have left without explanation. Something had happened. Someone had taken her. And in the aftermath, as the police investigation stalled and the press speculation intensified, Ethan had retreated into himself, building walls that no one had penetrated since. Until Olivia. Across the room, as if sensing his thoughts, Olivia looked up and met his gaze. For a brief moment, something passed between them, recognition, challenge, perhaps something deeper. Then she excused herself from her group and began making her way toward him. Ethan felt a sudden urge to flee, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who controlled every situation. But before he could move, Webb materialized at his side, his voice low and urgent. "We need to leave now." "What's happened?" Ethan asked, grateful for the interruption. "Security breach at the main server facility. Johnson is handling it, but your authorization is required for the lockdown protocol." Webb's expression was professionally neutral, but the tension in his jaw conveyed the severity of the situation. Ethan nodded. "Make my excuses to Jessica." As they moved toward the exit, Ethan glanced back to find Olivia watching them, her expression unreadable. Their eyes locked for a moment before Webb ushered him through the door and into the waiting car. "There's no security breach, is there?" Ethan asked, once they were moving through the Manhattan traffic. Webb's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. "No, sir, but you looked like you needed an exit strategy." After a decade and a half of service, Webb knew him too well. "Sullivan mentioned Sarah," Ethan said after a moment of silence. "He implied you knew something about her disappearance." Webb's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "Sullivan is trying to create discord. It's what he does." "That doesn't answer my question." "There's nothing to know that you don't already know, sir. Sarah Lawrence disappeared without a trace. The police investigation found no evidence of foul play." "And you believe that?" Webb's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting Ethan's for a brief moment. "I believe that dwelling on the past prevents you from seeing threats in the present. Sullivan has placed one of his people in your household. That should be our primary concern." Ethan turned to look out the window, watching the city lights blur as they crossed the bridge back to Connecticut. "You're certain Olivia works for him?" "She was at the gala tonight, as a guest, not staff." Webb's tone suggested this was all the evidence needed. "And our investigation has uncovered additional connections. During her time in Boston, she lived in the same building as Sarah's sister. The information landed like a physical blow. That can't be coincidence." "No, it can't. The question is, what does Sullivan hope to gain by placing her so close to you, and why now after all these years?" The rest of the drive passed in silence, Ethan's mind racing with possibilities. By the time they reached the estate, it was past midnight. The mansion was mostly dark, with only security lights illuminating the winding driveway. "I want her gone by morning," Ethan said, as the car stopped at the main entrance. Webb nodded. "I'll handle it." Inside, the house was quiet. Ethan bypassed his bedroom and headed straight for his study, knowing sleep would elude him. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and stood at the window, staring out at the darkness that hid the sound from view. Sarah's face appeared in his mind, not as she had been in those final days, but as he'd first met her, laughing in the rain outside a Boston cafe, her blonde hair plastered to her face, utterly unconcerned with her appearance as she debated technology ethics with a colleague. She'd been brilliant, challenging, alive in a way that had drawn him out of his self-imposed isolation. For 2 years, she had been his partner in every sense, breaking down his walls one by one, until he'd been ready to share everything with her, including the truth about his past. And then she was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just emptiness, where her laughter had once filled his world. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He turned, expecting Webb with an update on Olivia's dismissal. Instead, Olivia herself stood in the doorway, still wearing her gala dress. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "I saw the light on." Ethan set down his glass. "How did you get back here?" "Taxi," she said simply. "I left shortly after you did. May I come in?" Every instinct told him to refuse, to maintain the distance that kept him safe. Instead, he found himself gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "You should know that your employment here is terminated, effective immediately." If she was surprised, she didn't show it. She entered the study but didn't sit, choosing instead to stand near the bookshelves that lined one wall. "Because I attended the gala? Or because James Sullivan spoke to you?" "Both. And because you lied about your connection to Sarah Lawrence." At the mention of Sarah's name, something flickered across Olivia's face. Not guilt, but a deep sadness. That seemed too genuine to be fabricated. "I didn't lie," she said quietly. "For you never asked." "Don't play games with me, Miss Morgan. You lived in the same building as Sarah's sister in Boston. You worked for my business rival. You deliberately sought employment in my household under false pretenses." Olivia's gaze remained steady. "I lived in that building for 6 months. Yes, I knew who Emma Lawrence was. Everyone in the building did. She was kind to me during a difficult time in my life. And yes, I later worked for James Sullivan because he offered me an exceptional salary and creative freedom. Neither of these things were concealed with intent to deceive you." "Then why are you here?" Ethan demanded. "What do you want from me?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Olivia took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something difficult. "The truth? I wanted to meet the man Emma described, the one her sister had loved so completely, the one who disappeared into himself after she was gone." She took a step closer. "I wanted to understand how someone could simply stop living because they lost someone." Ethan felt exposed, as if she had reached across the space between them and physically stripped away his defenses. "You know nothing about me or what I lost." "I know more than you think." She reached into a small evening bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Emma asked me to give you this if I ever got close enough. She's tried to contact you for years, but your guard dogs are very effective at keeping people away." Ethan stared at the paper she held out, but didn't take it. "What is it?" "A letter Sarah wrote to you. Emma found it after she disappeared. She thought you should have it." Ethan's heart seemed to stop for a moment. "Why would I believe anything you say?" "Because despite what Webb and Sullivan have told you, I have no agenda here other than doing what Emma asked." Olivia placed the letter on his desk. "Read it or don't, that's up to you. But know that not everyone is your enemy, Mr. Blackwood. Some of us are just people trying to do the right thing." She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth, I wasn't fired from Sullivan's household. I left because I couldn't stomach his methods anymore. The man you think is your enemy was once your friend. The man you think is your friend." She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. "Webb has been with me for 15 years, Ethan said defensively. "And in all that time, has he ever encouraged you to move forward? Or has he simply enabled you to stay exactly where you are, isolated, untrusting, surrounded by walls of your own making?" Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and the letter on his desk. Ethan stared at the folded paper for a long moment, torn between the need to know and the fear of what Sarah's words might contain. Finally, his hand trembling slightly, he picked up the letter and unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Sarah's, the looping cursive she used when writing something personal rather than professional. "Ethan, if you're reading this, then I've gone. I don't know how to explain what's happening in a way that will make sense to you. I've discovered things about Blackwood Technologies, about the work Webb has been doing behind your back. The surveillance isn't just for security, E. It goes deeper. The system you created to protect people is being used to control them. Webb knows I've seen the files. He's been watching me for weeks. I'm not safe here anymore, but I can't leave without trying to warn you. There's so much you don't know about the man you trust most, about what happened to your parents, about the secrets he's kept from you. I'm leaving tonight to meet someone who can help. If all goes well, I'll come back with proof, and we can face this together." If I don't come back. Look deeper into Phoenix Protocol. It's not what you think it is. And Ethan, please remember that not everyone deserves your walls. Some people are worth the risk. Always. Ethan read the letter twice, his mind racing to process its implications. Phoenix Protocol had been the codename for the advanced security system Blackwood Technologies had been developing when Sarah disappeared, a system that had since become the company's most valuable asset and the foundation for the recent Department of Defense contract. Webb had been the project lead. Everything Ethan thought he knew suddenly shifted, the solid ground beneath him crumbling away. If Sarah's claims were true, if Webb had been operating without his knowledge, if he had played some role in Sarah's disappearance, then the past 5 years of his life had been built on lies. And Olivia Morgan, the woman he'd been prepared to dismiss as Sullivan's spy, might be the only person who could help him uncover the truth. The realization left him breathless. For years, he had maintained absolute control over his environment, keeping others at a distance to protect himself from further loss. But what if that control had been an illusion? What if the walls he'd built had actually imprisoned him, keeping him isolated while those he trusted manipulated the truth? He reached for his phone, then hesitated. If Webb was monitoring his communications, and Sarah's letter suggested he was, then every call, every text might be compromised. Even the security system in the mansion itself might be used against him. For the first time in years, Ethan Blackwood felt truly vulnerable, and, paradoxically, that vulnerability brought with it a strange sense of clarity. He had been sleepwalking through his life, allowing grief and fear to dictate his choices. Now, with everything he believed thrown into question, he felt more awake than he had since the night Sarah disappeared. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in his inner jacket pocket. Then, instead of returning to his bedroom, he made his way through the darkened mansion to the kitchen. He needed to find Olivia before Webb did, needed answers only she could provide. But when he reached the kitchen, it was empty. Continuing to the staff quarters in the east wing, he found her door ajar, the room beyond clearly vacant. A quick search revealed that her personal belongings were gone. No clothes in the closet, no toiletries in the attached bathroom. Only a small white card remained on the nightstand. If you're reading this, you've seen the letter and have questions. Meet me at Emma's Cafe in Boston. Sunday, 10 a.m. Come alone. Below the message was an address in Boston's North End. Ethan stared at the card, realizing Olivia had anticipated his response to Sarah's letter, had known he would seek her out once he read it, which meant she hadn't expected to be dismissed so abruptly, hadn't expected Webb to move so quickly. The implications were disturbing. Either Webb had been monitoring their interaction at the gala more closely than Ethan realized, or Olivia was playing a more complex game than she appeared to be. Ethan slipped the card into his pocket alongside Sarah's letter. If Webb knew about his interaction with Olivia at the gala, he might already know about the letter, in which case Ethan's window of opportunity to act independently was rapidly closing. He needed to leave the estate without alerting Webb, needed to find Olivia and get answers before it was too late. The thought of trusting someone he barely knew, someone who might still be working for Sullivan, went against every instinct he'd developed over the past 5 years. But, as Sarah's words echoed in his mind, "Not everyone deserves your walls," Ethan made his decision. For the first time since Sarah's disappearance, he would allow himself to trust someone, not because he was certain Olivia was telling the truth, but because the alternative, continuing to live within walls built on potential lies, was suddenly unbearable. Back in his room, Ethan quickly packed a small bag with essentials. Instead of using his own car, which would be easily tracked, he took a rarely used service elevator to the garage level and located the keys to the groundskeeper's truck, an older model without the sophisticated tracking systems built into his own vehicles. As he drove away from Blackwood Estate, the night deep and dark around him, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror at the glass fortress receding behind him. For 5 years, he had believed those walls protected him from the world. Now he wondered if they had merely kept him exactly where someone else wanted him. Boston in spring wore its charm differently than Connecticut. Where Greenwich was manicured perfection, Boston embraced its historical character with cobblestone streets and buildings that wore their age proudly. As Ethan navigated the narrow streets of the North End, memories of his life with Sarah flooded back. Sunday mornings at cafes just like the one he was seeking, walks along the Charles River, nights spent talking about the future they would build together. The coffee corner was a small establishment, wedged between an Italian bakery and a vintage bookstore. Its blue awning and window boxes filled with fresh herbs gave it a homey feel that stood in stark contrast to the sterile elegance Ethan had surrounded himself with for years. Through the window, he could see a diverse mix of patrons, students with laptops, elderly gentlemen reading newspapers, young professionals engaged in animated conversation, and there, at a corner table by the window, sat Olivia Morgan. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, a marked difference from both her chef's uniform and the elegant gala dress. She was writing in a notebook, her focus complete until the bell above the door announced Ethan's arrival. Her eyes found his immediately, widening slightly in apparent surprise. Had she not expected him to come? Ethan approached her table, hyper-aware of his appearance. He'd abandoned his usual tailored suit for jeans, a dark sweater and a leather jacket, clothes he kept for the rare occasions when anonymity was required. Without his usual armor, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that went beyond the physical. "You came," Olivia said as he took the seat across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." Sarah's letter didn't leave me much choice. His voice was low, controlled despite the turmoil inside him. "I need answers, starting with who you really are and how you're connected to all this." A waitress approached, but Olivia waved her away with a familiar smile, suggesting she was a regular here. "Did anyone follow you?" she asked once they were alone again. "I was careful. But if Webb is as embedded in my systems as Sarah suggested, he knows I'm gone by now." Olivia nodded, closing her notebook and sliding it into her bag. "Then we don't have much time. What do you want to know first?" "Everything," Ethan said simply. "No more games, no more half-truths. Start with how you knew Sarah." Olivia took a deep breath, as if preparing herself. "I didn't know Sarah personally. I knew Emma, her sister, as I told you. I was going through a difficult divorce and had just moved to Boston to start over. Emma lived across the hall. She was kind to me during a time when kindness was in short supply." "And how did you end up working for Sullivan?" "That came later. After Sarah disappeared, Emma was convinced it wasn't voluntary. She hired private investigators, followed every lead she could find. The police eventually stopped returning her calls, but she never gave up." Olivia's eyes held genuine sadness. "About 2 years ago, she discovered a connection between Blackwood Technologies and a classified government program called Phoenix Protocol. She believed whatever Sarah had uncovered about it was the reason she disappeared." "Phoenix Protocol was a security system," Ethan said firmly. "Advanced, yes, but hardly worth killing over." "That's what it was designed to be," Olivia agreed. "But according to Emma's research, Webb modified it without your knowledge. The system wasn't just monitoring potential threats, it was identifying individuals who might pose challenges to certain government interests and flagging them for preventative intervention." Ethan's mind raced to process this information. "You're suggesting Webb turned my security system into some kind of domestic surveillance program? That's absurd. I would have known." "Would you?" Olivia challenged gently. "When was the last time you were truly involved in the day-to-day operations of your company? After Sarah disappeared, you withdrew from everything. Webb stepped in, managing not just your security but your entire life. He controlled who you saw, what information reached you, even who worked in your home." The accusation stung because it contained an undeniable truth. Ethan had retreated after Sarah's disappearance, allowing Webb to handle increasingly important aspects of both his personal and professional life. What had seemed like loyal service might have been something far more calculating. If what you're saying is true, why would Sullivan get involved? He left Blackwood Technologies years before Phoenix Protocol was developed. Olivia's expression became more guarded. This is where it gets complicated. Sullivan wasn't always your enemy. According to Emma, he and Sarah were in contact before she disappeared. She had reached out to him with concerns about Webb's modifications to Phoenix Protocol. That's impossible, Ethan said sharply. Sarah would have come to me. She tried, Olivia said softly. According to the journal Emma found after her disappearance, Sarah had noticed discrepancies in the Phoenix Protocol code. When she brought them to your attention, you dismissed her concerns. She went to Sullivan as a last resort, because she knew he had the technical knowledge to understand what she'd discovered. Ethan searched his memory, trying to recall any conversation where Sarah had expressed concerns about the project. There had been something, a late-night discussion that had devolved into an argument. He'd been stressed about deadlines, irritated by what he'd perceived as her interference in his work. He'd told her to leave it alone, that she was seeing problems where none existed. Had that been her attempt to warn him? If Sullivan knew all, this, Ethan said slowly, why didn't he come to me directly after she disappeared? He tried. Webb intercepted every attempt. Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. These are copies of emails, phone records, even security footage from your company showing Webb systematically blocking Sullivan's efforts to reach you. Emma compiled all of this over years of investigation. Ethan took the envelope but didn't open it. And how did you get from knowing Emma to working in Sullivan's household? Emma introduced us when her cancer diagnosis came back terminal. Last year, she was desperate to find someone who could continue her search for the truth. Olivia's voice wavered slightly. Sullivan offered me a job that would give me access to resources Emma no longer had. I wasn't a spy in the traditional sense. I was a researcher, looking for connections between Phoenix Protocol and Sarah's disappearance. And then you came to work for me, Ethan said, the pieces beginning to fit together. Why? What did you hope to accomplish by becoming my chef of all things? Olivia's expression softened. Emma believed Webb had orchestrated Sarah's disappearance because she'd discovered what he was doing with Phoenix Protocol. But she also believed you were as much a victim as Sarah was, manipulated by someone you trusted implicitly. Before she passed away, she asked me to find a way to show you the truth. By infiltrating my household, Ethan said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. By getting close enough to give you Sarah's letter, Olivia corrected. Everything else, the way I challenged your isolation, the small changes to your routine, that wasn't part of some grand plan. That was just me being unable to watch someone live the way you were living, so completely closed off from the world. The honesty in her voice was disarming. For the first time since this conversation began, Ethan allowed himself to consider that Olivia might truly have been acting out of compassion rather than manipulation. You took a significant risk, he observed. If Webb had discovered your connection to Emma or Sullivan, it wasn't without precedent, Olivia said grimly. Emma believed at least 2 other people who tried to investigate Phoenix Protocol met with convenient accidents. A cold chill ran through Ethan. Are you suggesting Webb had them killed? I'm suggesting the program Webb created is worth killing to protect. Whether he personally ordered it or simply enabled a system that eliminates threats autonomously is something only Webb knows. The implications were staggering. If what Olivia was saying was true, then Webb had not only betrayed Ethan's trust, but had potentially used his technology to commit unspeakable acts. And Sarah, the woman Ethan had loved more than anything, might have disappeared because she tried to expose the truth. I need proof, Ethan said finally. Not second-hand accounts or circumstantial connections. Actual evidence that Webb modified Phoenix Protocol without my knowledge. I was hoping you'd say that. Olivia glanced at her watch. Which is why we have a meeting in 30 minutes with someone who can provide exactly what you're looking for. Who? The original programmer who worked with Webb on the Phoenix Protocol modifications. He left Blackwood Technologies 3 years ago after a supposed mental breakdown. He's been in hiding ever since, afraid Webb would come after him if he ever spoke about what they did. Ethan's pulse quickened. Where is he? Not far from here, but before we go, there's something else you need to know. Olivia hesitated, then continued. Sullivan isn't the villain Webb painted him to be, but he's not innocent either. He could have gone public with what he knew about Phoenix Protocol years ago. He chose not to because he saw an opportunity to use that information for leverage in business negotiations. Blackmail, Ethan said flatly. In essence, yes. Everyone in this story has their own agenda, Ethan. Even Emma, in her determination to find justice for her sister, made compromises I'm not entirely comfortable with. The only person who seems to have acted purely out of principle was Sarah. The mention of Sarah's name sent a fresh wave of pain through Ethan. If Webb was responsible for her disappearance, why keep me alive? Why not eliminate me as well? Because you're the face of Blackwood Technologies, the brilliant founder whose tragic personal loss led him to retreat from public life while still maintaining control of the company, or so the world believes. In reality, Webb has been running everything while using your reputation and authority as a shield. Olivia's gaze was steady. You weren't a threat because you chose not to see what was happening right in front of you. The accusation cut deep, precisely because it resonated with truth. Ethan had allowed himself to become exactly what Webb needed, a figurehead too consumed by personal grief to question the operation of his own company. The realization was both humiliating and infuriating. "Let's go," he said abruptly, standing. "I want to hear what this programmer has to say." As they left the cafe, neither noticed the black sedan parked across the street, nor the man inside speaking quietly into a phone. The programmer, a nervous man in his 30s named Alex, Chen, met them in a small apartment above a laundromat in Cambridge. The space was cluttered with computer equipment, empty energy drink cans and takeout containers, suggesting someone living on the edge of paranoia. "Mr. Blackwood," Chen said, his handshake weak and clammy, "I never thought I'd see you in person. Again." "Mr. Chen." Ethan searched his memory for any recollection of the man but came up empty. "I apologize, but I don't remember you from Blackwood Technologies." "You wouldn't. Webb kept me isolated from most of the team, said my work was too sensitive for general knowledge." Chen gestured to a desk covered with monitors. "I've prepared everything you need to see. The original Phoenix Protocol specifications, Webb's modifications, and the operational logs showing how the system has been used over the past 5 years." For the next hour, Chen walked Ethan through a technical nightmare. The Phoenix Protocol, originally designed as an advanced threat assessment system for cybersecurity, had been secretly transformed into something far more invasive. Webb's modifications had created a system capable of monitoring private communications, predicting potential whistleblowers and activists, and flagging them for what was euphemistically called intervention. The genius of it was plausible deniability, Chen explained, bringing up a series of code samples. The system never explicitly recommends elimination. It simply identifies threats and tracks them until they're no longer active in the system. "And by no longer active, you mean dead," Olivia said quietly. Chen nodded. "Or disappeared, like Sarah Lawrence." Ethan's head snapped up. "You have proof Sarah was targeted by Phoenix Protocol." "I have proof she was flagged as a critical threat 3 days before she disappeared." Chen pulled up a file showing Sarah's name, photograph, and a threat assessment rating of 98 out of 100. The system identified her as having accessed restricted code repositories. After that, Webb took over personally. Whatever happened next wasn't documented in the system. Ethan stared at Sarah's image on the screen, the reality of what he was seeing washing over him in waves of horror and rage. His technology, created to protect, had been perverted into a tool for surveillance and elimination, and the person he trusted most had used it against the woman he loved. "Does the system show any other potential targets?" he asked, his voice eerily calm despite the storm inside him. Chen hesitated. "Yes, there's a current list, updated daily." "Show me," Ethan demanded. Chen pulled up another screen. At the top of the list was James Sullivan with a threat rating of 87. Second was Emma Lawrence, though her status was marked inactive terminal illness. Third on the list with a steadily increasing threat rating was Olivia Morgan. And fourth, added just 24 hours ago, was Ethan Blackwood himself. Webb knows, Ethan said, the implications hitting him with physical force. He knows I've seen Sarah's letter, knows I'm investigating. The system monitors all communication to and from your devices, Chen confirmed. The moment you left the estate without security, your threat rating jumped from dormant to active. We need to go, Olivia said urgently. If Webb knows you're meeting with Chen... The sound of breaking glass interrupted her. Something small and metallic bounced across the floor, emitting a thick cloud of smoke that rapidly filled the apartment. Out! Now! Ethan shouted, grabbing both Olivia and Chen by their arms and pulling them toward the door. But as they reached it, the door burst open, revealing two men in tactical gear, their faces covered with gas masks. Mr. Blackwood, one of them said, his voice muffled but recognizable. Jeffries, Ethan's driver for the past decade. Mr. Webb sent us to bring you home for your safety. I'm not going anywhere with you, Ethan said, positioning himself in front of Olivia and Chen. I'm afraid that's not your decision, sir. Jeffries raised what looked like a taser. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Time seemed to slow. Ethan saw Olivia reaching for something in her bag, saw Chen backing toward the window, panic in his eyes, saw Jeffries' finger tightening on the trigger. In that moment, the walls Ethan had built around himself, the control, the distance, the emotional fortress, shattered completely. For the first time in 5 years, he acted purely on instinct, throwing himself forward into Jeffries with all his strength. The taser discharged, the barbs missing Ethan by inches. The two men crashed to the floor, Ethan's momentum carrying them into the second intruder. There was a confusion of limbs, shouting, the acrid smell of the smoke grenade burning Ethan's lungs. "Run!" he shouted to Olivia and Chen. "Get out through the back." Through the chaos, he saw Olivia hesitate, clearly torn between escaping and helping him. "Go," he insisted. "I'll find you." She nodded once, then grabbed Chen's arm and disappeared into the thickening smoke. Jeffries landed a solid punch to Ethan's jaw, temporarily stunning him. The second intruder was already up, moving after Olivia and Chen. Fighting through pain and disorientation, Ethan grabbed the fallen taser and fired it at the pursuing man's back. The barbs connected, sending the man crashing to the floor in a convulsing heap. Jeffries was on his feet now, reaching for something at his waist, a real gun, not a taser. Ethan launched himself forward again, catching Jeffries' arm as the weapon discharged. The bullet shattered a nearby monitor, sending sparks and glass flying. They struggled for control of the gun, crashing into furniture, neither willing to yield. Jeffries had the advantage of training, but Ethan fought with the desperation of a man who had finally awakened to the truth and would not be silenced again. When the gun went off a second time, both men froze. For a moment, Ethan thought he'd been shot. There was a burning sensation in his side, but it was Jeffries who slowly collapsed, the fight leaving his eyes as blood spread across his tactical vest. Ethan dropped the gun as if it had burned him. Despite everything, he had never wanted this, had never wanted anyone to be hurt because of him. He knelt beside Jeffries, pressing his hands against the wound. "Why?" he demanded. "Why would you do this? You've known me for years." Jeffries coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Just following orders, always just following orders." "Webb's orders," Ethan said, not a question, but a confirmation. Jeffries nodded weakly. He said, "You were having a breakdown. That we needed to bring you home for your own good." "And Sarah, was that for my own good too?" Jeffries' eyes widened slightly, genuine confusion crossing his face. "I don't know anything about what happened to her. Webb handled that one personally." The sound of sirens filtered through the broken window. Someone in the building must have heard the gunshots and called the police. Ethan needed to leave, needed to find Olivia and Chen before Webb's other operatives did. "I'm sorry," he said to Jeffries, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. Then he grabbed Chen's laptop and external drive, shoving them into a backpack he found under the desk, and headed for the back exit. The rear stairs led to an alley behind the laundromat. Ethan emerged into fresh air, his lungs burning from the smoke, his mind racing to process everything that had happened. He had just been part of a shootout. A man who had worked for him for years might be dying. And somewhere in the city, Webb's other operatives were hunting Olivia and Chen, hunting him. The sound of running footsteps made him press himself against the wall, ready to fight again if necessary. But it was Olivia who appeared around the corner, her face streaked with soot but otherwise unharmed. "Ethan!" Relief flooded her features. "Thank God, I heard gunshots." "I'm okay," he assured her. "Where's Chen?" "We split up. He said he'd be safer on his own, that he has other hiding places Webb doesn't know about." She glanced nervously at the street beyond the alley. "We need to go. More of Webb's people could be coming." "We can't go to the police," Ethan said, thinking aloud. "Not with Webb's connections to government agencies. We need somewhere safe. To review everything on Chen's computers, somewhere Webb wouldn't think to look." Olivia hesitated only briefly. "I know a place, but you have to trust me completely." The Ethan Blackwood of a month ago, isolated, controlled, walled off from genuine human connection, would have refused, would have seen the risk as too great, the potential for betrayal too high. But that man no longer existed. In his place stood someone new, someone who understood that true safety wasn't found in isolation, but in connection, in trust. "Lead." "The way," he said, taking her hand. As police cars screamed past the alley entrance, Ethan and Olivia moved in the opposite direction, two figures united against a system that had sought to keep them apart. And for the first time since Sarah's disappearance, Ethan felt something he'd thought lost forever: hope. 3 days later, James Sullivan stood in his San Francisco office, staring at the stack of evidence Ethan and Olivia had compiled. The Phoenix Protocol Code, Webb's modifications, the surveillance logs, and most damning of all, email exchanges between Webb and certain government officials authorizing containment measures for individuals deemed threats to national security. "This goes higher than Webb," Sullivan said, rubbing his temple. "Much higher. If we go public with this, we're taking on people who can make both of us disappear without a trace." "I know," Ethan's voice was resolute, "but it's the only way to stop it, and the only way to get justice for Sarah and everyone else targeted by this system." Sullivan studied him thoughtfully. "You've changed. The Ethan Blackwood I knew 5 years ago would have calculated the costs, weighed the benefits, and chosen the path of self-preservation." "That Ethan Blackwood was living in a prison of his own making," Ethan replied, glancing at Olivia, who sat quietly nearby. "It took someone brave enough to challenge my walls to help me see it." Sullivan's gaze shifted to Olivia. "Emma would be proud of you. She never gave up believing the truth would come out eventually." Olivia nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I just wish she'd lived to see it." "What happens now?" Sullivan asked, turning back to Ethan. "Now we do what Sarah would have wanted. We expose everything, the surveillance program, the targeted eliminations, the government complicity. We tear down the entire system." Ethan's voice hardened. "And we make sure Webb and everyone involved faces justice." "They'll come after you with everything they have," Sullivan warned. "Your reputation, your company, your freedom, all of it will be at risk." "Some things are worth the risk," Ethan said simply, his hand finding Olivia's. "I've spent 5 years hiding from the world, convinced that isolation was the only way to protect myself from pain. I was wrong. The walls I built didn't protect me. They imprisoned me." Olivia squeezed his hand, a silent affirmation of his words. In the short time they'd been on the run together, something had shifted between them, a connection neither had expected but both now embraced. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore, it was about rebuilding a life worth living. "Well, then," Sullivan said with a hint of his old confidence, "let's bring down the house of cards together." As they left Sullivan's office, stepping into the bright California sunshine, Ethan felt the weight of the past 5 years finally beginning to lift. Webb had been apprehended trying to flee the country, his carefully constructed web of power unraveling as evidence of his crimes emerged. The Phoenix Protocol system had been shut down, its surveillance capabilities permanently disabled. There would be challenges ahead, legal battles, public scrutiny, the painful process of rebuilding trust in both his company and himself. But, for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't facing the future alone. "What are you thinking?" Olivia asked as they walked along the waterfront, the Golden Gate Bridge rising majestically in the distance. Ethan considered the question. "I'm thinking about Sarah, about how she tried to show me the truth and I refused to see it, about how much time I wasted hiding behind walls she would have hated." "She would understand," Olivia said gently. "Grief changes us in ways we can't control. The important thing is that you found your way back." Ethan gazed out at the water, its surface glittering in the afternoon sun. "Not back," he corrected quietly. "Forward. I can't go back to who I was before Sarah disappeared. That person doesn't exist anymore. But I can move forward, carrying what she taught me." Olivia smiled, the wind tugging at her hair. "And what was that?" "That walls don't protect you, they just keep you from living." He turned to face her fully. "That some people are worth the risk of being vulnerable again." The look that passed between them held no need for further words. They had both been broken in different ways, had both built defenses to survive their respective traumas. And now together they were learning to dismantle those barriers brick by brick. 3 weeks later, as the full extent of Webb's crimes became public, Ethan stood in his Greenwich estate for the last time. The glass and steel structure that had once been his fortress now felt cold and empty, a monument to isolation rather than a home. He had decided to sell it, to break completely with the prison his life had become. As he walked through the east wing toward the kitchen, memories of Olivia's first days here flooded back. The wildflowers on the dining table, the handwritten menu cards, the small acts of rebellion that had begun to crack his carefully constructed walls. He smiled at the thought of how annoyed he'd been, how determined to maintain his distance. The kitchen was empty now, the staff having been given generous severance packages and recommendations. Ethan ran his hand along the countertop where he'd first confronted Olivia about her connection to Sullivan. So much had happened since that night, so much revealed, so much changed. His phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Finished at the YA lawyer's office. Boston apartment is officially ours. Still sure about this?" Ethan typed back without hesitation. Never been more sure of anything. The decision to move back to Boston had come naturally. Not to his and Sarah's old neighborhood, but to a brownstone in Back Bay that he and Olivia had found together. A new beginning in the city where he had once been happy and where Olivia had begun her journey to find him. As he left the mansion, for the final time, Ethan paused in the driveway, looking back at the imposing structure silhouetted against the evening sky. For years, he had believed this place kept him safe. Now he understood that true safety wasn't found in isolation or control, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to connect. The truth about Sarah's disappearance had been even darker than they'd imagined. The investigation sparked by their evidence had uncovered a network of government officials, private contractors, and corporate interests using Phoenix Protocol to eliminate perceived threats to their power. Sarah hadn't been the first victim, but thanks to her sister's determination and Olivia's courage, she would be among the last. Webb had maintained his silence, refusing to implicate his powerful accomplices even as evidence mounted against him. But the system he'd helped create was being dismantled piece by piece, its victims finally finding justice, and Ethan, who had once defined himself by his ability to control every aspect of his environment, was learning to embrace uncertainty, to find strength not in walls, but in connections, to look into Olivia's eyes and allow himself to be truly seen. Life beyond the glass walls was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes painful. But it was also vibrant, authentic, and filled with possibilities. As Ethan drove away from his former prison toward a future he couldn't control but chose to embrace, he felt something he'd thought forever lost, the exhilarating freedom of being fully alive. When he arrived at their hotel that evening, Olivia was waiting for him on the balcony, wrapped in a light sweater against the spring breeze. She turned as he joined her, her eyes searching his face. "How was it?" she asked. "Saying goodbye to the house?" "It wasn't the house I needed to say goodbye to," he replied, taking her hands in his. "It was the person I became there. The man who thought he could control everything, who kept everyone at a distance, who was so afraid of being hurt again that he stopped living. Olivia's smile was tender. I liked that man too, you know, even with all his walls and rules. There was something in him worth fighting for. Ethan pulled her close, still amazed at how easily she had broken through his defenses. Sarah's letter said not everyone deserves walls, some people are worth the risk. Wise woman, Olivia murmured. She would have liked you, Ethan said softly. You have the same stubbornness, the same refusal to accept anything less than the truth. I wish I could have known her, Olivia replied, but in a way I feel like I do, through Emma's stories, through you. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lights of Boston come alive as darkness fell. Tomorrow they would begin moving into their new home. Tomorrow the next chapter of their lives would start. But tonight, in this moment of transition, they simply held each other, two people who had found each other across barriers of grief, suspicion, and fear. What are you thinking? Ethan asked, echoing her question from weeks before. Olivia looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the city lights. I'm thinking that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most broken places, and that finding you, the real you behind all those walls, was worth every risk. He kissed her then, not with the desperation of someone afraid to lose, but with the certainty of someone who had found something precious and wasn't afraid to cherish it. To protect it not with walls but with trust. To nurture it not with control but with freedom. In that moment, surrounded by the city they would now call home, Ethan Blackwood, once isolated in his glass kingdom, embraced the beautiful uncertainty of a life beyond the walls he'd built, a life where connection trumped control, where vulnerability became strength, where looking into someone's eyes meant not just being seen, but truly seeing in return. And as night settled over Boston, two people who had once been strangers stood entwined on a hotel balcony, their past traumas not forgotten but transformed, stepping stones rather than barriers on the path to a future they would build together, one day at a time. Fimda Historia. Dear listeners, we hope the journey of Ethan and Olivia has touched your hearts. Their path from isolation to connection reminds us that sometimes our greatest strength lies not in the walls we build, but in the courage to let others in. If this story of healing and second chances resonated with you, we've created a special playlist of equally captivating narratives that explore the complexity of human connection. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore life's deepest questions and most powerful emotions. Don't miss our upcoming content. We have many more journeys to share. We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments below.